Thank you so much, and thank you, SG Tech, for having us here today. I feel very, very honored and very lucky to be on a panel with these three amazing people. As the title of the session reflects, this really is public-private partnership and everything in between. So hopefully you're going to get a really good experience hearing about the views from different parts and different sectors and different segments of society. So what I'm going to do today is we're going to get everybody a chance to introduce themselves, and then we'll jump into discussion proper. So shall we start with Zheng. Zheng, could you say a few words about yourself and what your views of public-private partnership are?
Hi everyone, my name is Zheng, and I'm from the company called Accredify. It's one that we started 4 years ago, and a lot of people don't know this, even some of the people closest to me, but Accredify actually started as a private-public partnership. So the first time that we decided to start Accredify was when we were at GovTech's office, and then back then we were in a sort of a pivot in a very early stage of our startup, where we were deciding, what can we do going forward, because we were just doing a change of business model. And I remember I was at GovTech's office, and seated across me was Deputy Director back then, Stephen. And then he basically told me that the role of the government here is to build the infrastructure, right? We build the highways, we build the infrastructure, and it's for you guys, the startups, the companies, to build all the different commercial entities, the different business values on top of that highway, in order to increase the overall value of it. To be honest, I was sold back then, and that became history. So to me, private-public partnership is about the ability to connect and harmonize the private and public sector to create a bigger value. And especially when it comes to digital trust, is to enable not just authority or companies in a more authoritative position to be able to provide that kind of trust. How can we decentralize that and allow both the private sector, the individuals, as well as the public sector to provide that digital trust? So thanks, Annabelle.
Thank you so much, Zheng. And I always love hearing origin stories. So I'm feeling like this origin stories actually was in a Star Wars-shaped building. Were you in Hive when this happened? Just because you want to add to this superhero-like and coming up with this sort of amazing idea that I think is game-changing. And that's really where I think a meeting of minds makes a difference, and you really do get an acceleration of ideas and opportunities as well. I'm going to turn to our second panelist today, Yong. And so Yong obviously is, has been in the industry for a very long time, and he is from SBF. So Yong, would you like to introduce yourself and talk to us about what you think of public-private partnership?
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yong from the Singapore Business Federation. So SBF was set up 20 years ago to represent the views of the private sector as the Apex Business Chamber. We currently have some 28,000 members, comprising both companies as well as trade associations and chambers. So we're kind of like the umbrella body that brings together the views and concerns of the private sector and to represent them to the government. We play three key roles. The first is as a bridge between the private sector and the government. So really being at the core of public-private partnership. We seek to understand the needs of the business community, the challenges they face, the support that they need, and we'll advocate on their behalf to the government for policy changes, for incentive, for assistance schemes, and so on. But the other way, the bridge must work both ways. We also seek to understand government policies. What is it that the government is doing, planning to do? What are the assistance schemes, the incentive schemes that the government has, and then we help to explain it to our members, to companies, so that companies can better understand what the government is doing, as well as make best use of the government assistance and incentive schemes. So kind of, I guess this sitting is quite apt. We are kind of between the private sector and the public sector, being a Apex Business Chamber. So that's the first role as the bridge. The second key role we play is as a facilitator. We work with our members, we work with companies to facilitate their growth journey. We help companies in terms of internationalization, moving out of Singapore, expanding the market overseas. We help them with digitization and transformation. We help them with issues like environmental, social, and governance. So really working with companies one-to-one to help them in their growth journey. The third key role is as an enabler of a strong business ecosystem in Singapore. We seek to bring companies, trade associations, public sector agencies, all the different parts of Singapore to work together to build a stronger business ecosystem, including getting companies to work with each other, coming together so that they can overcome lack of economy of skills, especially when we go overseas. So we like to remind many of our companies that, well, maybe in Singapore they may think they are quite big, but when they go outside of Singapore, it's a completely different scale. And we can better compete, and we can better help our companies if we can work together when we go outside of Singapore. Yeah, so that's what SBF does, and very much at the center of bringing the public and the private sector to work together.
Thank you so much, Yong. And I don't know how you handle 28,000 members. That's literally, I think, 10% of all companies in Singapore. So representing those views in front of government must be such a critical and important role. So thank you, I think, for all the work that SBF does for Singapore companies everywhere. Finally, I am turning to our public sector representative, Ih-Ming. Ih-Ming, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, DISG, and how you guys contribute to public-private partnership?
Sure. Hi everyone, thank you for having me. My name is Ih-Ming. I lead a group called Digital Industries Singapore. You can think of us as a joint office between 3 government agencies that deal in the digital economy. So that's the Economic Development Board of Singapore, Enterprise Singapore, and the Infocom and Media Development Authority. So this joint office basically looks at the competitiveness and attractiveness of the ICT space in Singapore and that tech ecosystem and those enablers. So that's what we focus a lot of time on. We account manage quite a number of companies, if you will, and I was joking earlier in the pre-session that I guess our whole job is a public-private partnership, in part because we sit at this interface between what the role of the government is and what we're building out, whether it's in the policy infrastructure or the actual physical digital infrastructure, but also understanding what the needs of companies are and the fact that the government or the public sector or public sector monies can go towards enabling some of that growth, but doesn't always need to, if the market is functioning quite well. So maybe I'll leave it at that first, and then we'll kind of open the conversation.
Thank you so much, Ih-Ming. And I mean, all of you today here, you've probably heard a fair amount about digital trust and what that means from different perspectives already today. And when we think about it from the perspective of public-private partnership, I wonder if there are any new angles or anything important that we need to think about when we're actually trying to build a PPP in regards to digital trust. It's a fairly nascent area. I think me and the panelists were talking about that before we came onto the panel today. So I just want to turn to what I think is probably the greatest expert on this with 28,000 members. Yong, could you tell us a little bit about what are some of your thoughts in terms of where you've seen public-private partnerships work in the past, and more importantly, that you think would be most important when we're moving into a digital trust environment or conversation? Okay. If we look back over the past 2+ years of living with COVID, I think one of the key trend we see on the private sector side is the great push towards digitalization. What used to be a good to have, companies realize that it become a must-have when their employees have to work from home, when retail shops have to be closed and so on. Digitalization became a lifeline. Those that had invested in it earlier reaped the benefit of it. Those who had not found that they had to very quickly invest in it and to get onto a digital platform in order for their business to survive. So that, in a way, benefited a lot from public-private partnership. Companies benefited a lot of the schemes from the various agencies that Ih-Ming talked about, IMDA, Enterprise Singapore, and also many of our platform providers that allow them to quickly get onto the digital platforms. But with that came the challenge of cybersecurity and digital trust. And over the past few years, we have also seen a great uptick in terms of scams, in terms of data breaches that has also affected consumer confidence in digital platforms. So increasingly, this part about digital trust, cybersecurity is becoming more and more important as more and more business rely on digital platform for doing their business. So I think in terms of what we can do for digital trust, in terms of public-private partnership, I think there'll be, I see in 3 key areas. First is education and awareness. There's a need for the private sector working with government agencies to increase awareness, both among businesses as well as among consumers, about digital trust and security. Second is capacity building. Businesses need the expertise, and it's not so easy for SMEs to build up such expertise.
But suppose if you ask the SME, they'll say, well, first in Singapore, we have people like Amazon, Facebook, LinkedIn, TikTok, pay ridiculous amount of money because they got lots of investors, so they pay huge amount of money, grab all the talent. Then after that, they'll say, we have GovTech, GovTech also pay a lot of money, also take a lot of talent. Then we have the large local company. Then SMEs cannot afford the type of money to get talent. So they face a lot of challenge in that. So I think there's a lot of scope for the public and private sector to work together to uplift capability. We need to train more people, have a greater pool of talent to handle digital trust, cybersecurity, so that the SMEs can have they need not employ those people, that they need access to such services and talent. So that's the second part. I think the third big part will be in terms of advocacy. The private sector, through trade associations and chambers like SBF, need to be active in giving feedback to the government on the regulatory aspect. We want to ensure that the regulatory regime is one that facilitates business and not one that goes to the extreme of security and end up strangling businesses. So it is important to strike a balance. We can't have a very lax regime that anything goes and things keep going wrong and affect trust. But we also cannot have a regime that is so stringent or so unique that makes it difficult for us to do business in Singapore. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And that's really, really insightful. I mean, the fact that with SMEs, trying to figure out how do you actually get access to trusted service providers at a good price. I think that's going to be ultimately a challenge down the road as well, as more and more SMEs have moved online. And as you say, it's not a trend that can be reversed anymore. Ih-Ming, I have a really interesting question for you. I want to know, from your perspective, being on the public sector side of the house, how do you think we would be able to respond to kind of the I guess, challenges that have been raised by Yang as well just now?
Sure, no, that's a great question. Just to kind of build on Yang's point, I think there are various aspects. If I think about the role of the public sector, government, if you will, and then I'll maybe touch on my perspective on the role of industry. So the first is, I think the point was made that, clearly larger companies with assets, resources, there are many things they can do on their own if they decide to build something out. Smaller companies, whether that's SMEs or even smaller startups, we certainly want to create, if you will, I wouldn't say level playing field, but certainly not make it so asymmetric, right? So a very important part of the infrastructure, if you will, beyond kind of the policy infrastructure that the government can provide, is actually even, one example would be public kind of digital infrastructure, open infrastructure, right? So examples of these include 𝗏𝗏 Financial Data Exchange, for example, right? So the MAS or this is more of a consumer example, but the MAS or the Smart Nation Digital Government Group, creating this exchange where individuals, consumers, right, and many of you may have used this, using your own digital ID, right, creating a more centralized kind of, or consent management platform, right, allowing businesses to and consumers to kind of exchange financial information, right? The other aspect is what is the industry role, right? And government can build out infrastructure, but if we think about the co-creation opportunity, actually where the value or the new market opportunity should be really quite industry-led, right? And some of you may be quite familiar with this concept of alliances for action. And for those of you who are less familiar, in Singapore, several years ago, there were several kind of industry-led consortia, right? Industry-led consortia, companies large and small, that would identify business opportunities or, if you will, problem statements that, either not intractable, but very difficult to coordinate around, or, no individual kind of company, large or small, would be able to kind of resolve. And then the government would kind of think about its own role. One example where there was some sort of public-private partnership there is SG TradeX, right? So, and that's more to address sharing of documentation and data in the trade and logistics space, right? So I think that's certainly a role for government to think about the policy infrastructure, open and public, if you will, digital infrastructure. And then obviously a lot of the use cases and that kind of instinct, or where the money might be the kind of commercial opportunity might be, my perspective ought to be a bit more industry-led, otherwise you kind of be pushing on a string.
So I really like the idea of kind of like what is the policy infrastructure that we need to build to enable sort of better public-private partnership, but also better access? Because I think that was Young's point. It's access to the right service providers that's a bit of a challenge. I also want to point to, I guess, and I'm sort of thinking out loud a little bit, because I know IMDA, for example, did a lot of work around things like accrediting certain companies, and also with SG Go Digital subsidizing certain kind of trusted service providers. And kind of, I'm going to look a little bit to 𝗀𝗻𝗿 here with Accredify, because obviously you offer a particular service that I think, is often your client base are SMEs or maybe more like, in some large local enterprises as well. So could you maybe speak a little bit to kind of what do you think from a PPP perspective, how could Accredify benefit from certain mechanisms that could be actually made available so that maybe your customer base who you've not been able to access actually knows you exist, have a product that you can offer at a very reasonable price that is highly trusted? I'd love your point of view on that.
I think what Young and Ih-Ming said was really very real, because if we bring ourselves 2.5 years ago, during the peak of the pandemic, I remember back then, Accredify was a company that was providing certification for academic institutes. So our clients were like the likes of NUS, SMU, NTU, so on and so forth. We basically helped them to issue verifiable degrees and diplomas. But when the pandemic came, we actually got in touch with MOH as well as the other way around to start to see the importance of healthcare records for third-party authentication. Because traditionally, medical records, if you do a test, you basically consume it yourself, you understand what you need to do, and that's it. But when COVID came, that changed, right? Your COVID-19 test result, vaccination cert, so on and so forth, now requires a third party to authenticate. Be it going into a venue, be it flying home to visit a family, so on and so forth, right? So back then, we started a PPP, so-called, with MOH, GovTech, Temasek, to create a standard to issue a COVID-19 medical records so that we can harmonize the public sector, the private sector, as well as all the downstream stakeholders, including your airports, your airlines, to be able to read that single document. So, I mean, that in itself is something that is quite impossible for the GPs, your mom and pop GPs, to do it on their own, right? You can't expect them to have the technical capability. Some of them, I actually went down to the clinics, and some of them are still using cabinets with the paper files and all the patients' records. We're not even digital yet. We are talking about digital trust. So these are the kind of clinics that we have to engage, because from a ministry point of view, it's always the lowest denominator. We have to provide a solution for them. So back then, after creating that, we then follow on to work with GovTech, IMDA again, to have what we call an ADS scheme. It's an advanced digital solution, if I remember correctly, basically to subsidize the adoption of such technology, to ease the SMBs into adopting such digital trust, because there's just such an importance. So we do see this kind of initiative going forward in a lot of different industry, especially with Ih-Ming's and Young's support. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And I think, again, sort of co-creating those opportunities, I feel, it's amazing that it happens, but at the same time, it's quite ad hoc. So at some point later in the conversation, I'd love to hear from everybody on this panel about what they think is that one thing that we could do to make it a bit more mechanized. AWS loves its mechanisms, so I'm going to borrow a term that we're very familiar with and just talk about what is the one or two things we could do. But right now, I do want to just ask one more question to Ih-Ming before we move on to a different topic. Ih-Ming, so when Young mentioned that, one of the challenges is like capacity gaps, right? Capacity building gaps. I'm very interested to know what the government is thinking about how to close some of those gaps. Do you think that from a skills perspective, there's more that government can be doing? Is this a PPP thing as well?
Sure. I think there are two aspects, my quick reaction. The first is more kind of in the technical space, right? So if one of the areas in talent is that there's a dearth of talent, or there are very specific technical skills, or there's a role for public monies to go into, and so one example would be research money that would go into trust tech, right, or trust tech innovation. So the examples of this, IMDA partnered with NTU on this front just in June earlier this year. So investment of public monies into kind of the technical space, and some of the capacity building either in a kind of academic institution or setting, but really capacity building for talent. And the second area is a little less technical, but no less important, and that's really in the point about norm setting and governance and know-how in that area. I half suspect that given how nascent but fast-growing this space is, the demand for talent in that space is going to far outstrip supply. And so one of my thoughts is, how can the government partner with industry, because the government can't be the only receptacle for this capacity building. How can we partner with industry to actually build, a larger community of practice, for example, or just capacity build of individuals who are not just familiar, but actually operating at a particular level of sophistication, especially if the ambition is regional or global.
Thank you so much for that point, that last point that you made, Ih-Ming, because I think right now, I think one of the next things that I really want to be asking the panelists on is a lot of our conversation has been focused today about PPP within Singapore, which is a great place to start, by the way. As AWS as a business here, I think Singapore is one of the most friendly environments to be working in, and the government is always a huge support. The talent is there. But, I really want to think about going beyond that, because ultimately digital trust, the very core part of that is cross-border data flows, is that data is going to move across borders, that businesses are going to want to grow regionally and globally as well. So turning back to Young, I'm very interested to hear from you as well, in your capacity in SBF, but also in your capacity in ABAC, kind of looking beyond, how do you think we could be able to grow PPP beyond Singapore?
Sure. I think it's stating the obvious that we need to have open and ability for data to flow across borders. And I think when you look at digital business, a lot of the advantage that digitalization gives is the ability to scale across borders. Ideally, it will be borderless when it comes to the digital world. But we do know in reality, there is increasing concern by different countries, rules about data localization, cross-border data protection, and so on, which from the company's perspective, private sector perspective, there's always the concern that, are these excuses for protectionist measures? And are these in another form of trade barriers? We are quite more familiar with trade barriers, tariffs, when it comes to physical goods. We have things like free trade agreements across countries that try and address some of this. So it's important that there is a digital equivalent of this, and that's why we have been quite glad for the industry to have been able to work with the Singapore government on the DEAs, the Digital Economy Agreements, on the DIPA, Digital Economy Partnership Agreements, and so on. And we do hope to see more of this, not just on a country-to-country bilateral basis, but on a multilateral basis. And one of the things we have been doing, I'm one of Singapore's members to the APAC Business Advisory Council. 𝗦𝗽𝗻𝗻, the president of SG-Stack, is one of the other members. And actually, he's been working very hard at the APAC level across the 21 economies to push the issues about digital trust and to ensure that how can we have a regulatory regime that is harmonized or at least consistent across the different economies, and not so that businesses don't have to worry about dealing with different rules and different regulations in every single different economy that we have to deal with. And that makes really doing business very complicated. And I think that's where the private sector feedback is very important, not just Singapore businesses giving feedback to the Singapore government, but we need our counterparts in the different economies to also be giving feedback to their government and to nudge the governments to come together on this very important topic of digital trust and ensure that there is a conducive environment that continue to allow the free flow of data and business.
Thank you so much, Ih-Ming. Kind of on that note, I sort of want to really turn to Zheng here. Zheng, I know Accredify recently joined a new alliance, was it, of SMEs and startups from all over Asia. And I think the point that you made there about how different companies in different countries need to be also saying the same things and raising this issue to governments everywhere. So I want to just ask you a little bit about some of your thoughts around that, and whether that alliance in particular is a way in which some of these messages get out as well.
So the alliance is called Digital Prosperity for Asia. It's made out of a bunch of companies, startups, and different people in the organization. We have different members from different countries as well. And it's a roadshow base. We started in Singapore, went to Korea. The next stop should be India, if I'm not wrong. And the whole idea is to promote digitalizations in the different countries, especially in empowering the SMBs. But just taking a step back to kind of reflect on what Yang said, right, about different countries, different markets, and kind of sharing of data. I think everyone here probably heard this phrase where they say data is the new oil, right? Data is the new oil. You know, it's not wrong from a value perspective, but what I find very wrong with that statement is that oil or any other physical assets is usually exhaustive. So if I use the oil, you don't get the oil, right? But when it comes to data, it's very different. So data actually gets even more powerful when they are cohortized, aggregated, shared, you know, being shared and used in different manner and analyzed, and then later on the insights are used back to then generate more data. So to me, maybe the concept of, you know, data is the new oil is something that we need to probably try not to be too hard on, so that countries or markets stop thinking that I need to protect my own data, right? And when that happens, then I think there'll be a lot better flow of different data. But again, just to add on a bit on that, I think to us in the company, there's this concept called trusted, but there's also this concept called trustless, right? Trusted versus trustless. And I think digital trust has to be a combination of these two things. When I talk about trusted, I think of assets, of entities, where I can do certain things like certification, trust mark, where I can make you a trusted person, right? A trusted counterparty. But I believe that processes have to be trustless. And I think this morning, if you guys were around, DBS Piyush Gupta said that blockchain or DLT will be the back office of the world. That's the whole idea. Processes have to be trustless. Right? Today, when you send a WhatsApp, when you send an email, if you really drill down on the different stakeholders that particular message and packet of data goes through, you're going to find a lot of trouble, right? So there's this concept of trusted versus trustless as well. And then perhaps I can just end it off with sharing that, you know, we built everything on AWS, and that has made our life really easy, because in different countries where there's data residency, data protection, and so on and so forth, we always have AWS as the partner that can help us ensure that in the different locality, we have the right certification and protection in place. Not because Annabelle is here, just my honest statement.
Well, thank you for saying that. And well, you've thrown me a little bit because I wasn't exactly that statement, so I really did not set him up to say that. And kind of like thinking out loud, because I really love that idea of trusted and trustless. I want to come back to that later on when we think about perhaps whether or not from a PPP perspective, that's something that can also be pushed as a concept. But I want to just take a moment to actually turn over to Ih-Ming. Ih-Ming, I'm very interested to hear from you. I know there were other sessions today where people already were talking about trusted data flows, but kind of at a G2G or G2B level, or maybe even a G with pushing B2B, is there anything on your end that you think you'd like to see more from a PPP perspective to ensure trusted data flows?
It's a good question. I'm not an expert in that space. My response actually in as far as I guess what the public can do, you know, private sector players and public sector players can do, is hopefully not too non-PC. I think actually G2G work or G2G takes a long time, and I actually would urge and maybe even look to encourage you know, very clear use cases, B2B and very industry-led, I think is our approach. So as far as kind of DISG is concerned, actually our work directly with companies is actually to kind of tease out some of these actual pain points and actual use cases, and then to try and support some of these companies to tackle and address these. So that would be our approach. And certainly that will kind of come in parallel with, you know, many of the kind of broader, larger multi-led and bi-led work that Yang had talked about. I think we need both tracks. Yeah, so that's my quick sense.
Thank you so much. And I kind of think, you know, and I completely agree with you, right? And already there are these mechanisms, like ABAC is a great mechanism in parallel track that companies can be then working together to also push some of these ideas and these frameworks out. Agreed that G2G takes time, but Singapore has actually done an amazing job at like pushing out DEAs and DEPAs all across the world already. So you've got quite a few of them down, and I do think that that's a great model. So it's something that even as a company, we've actually been talking to a lot of governments in other parts of the world to say, think about doing something like that, you know, because it really helps. Us, but it also helps, more importantly, our customers who are SMEs and startups who don't have a lot of time to sit down and try and figure out whether the laws actually match up or resources, you know, to be able to do that. Yeah.
I think on that point, just to build on that, I would say one of the focuses, since we're talking about digital trust per se, is interoperability. I don't think they were there yet. I think as many of these different systems evolve in different theaters globally, interoperability will be extremely important for us all to kind of collectively realize this value, if you will, right? Otherwise, it will end up being a bit more narrow.
Thank you so much for that. We have just a little bit of time left, so I really want to take this opportunity to pick, you know, all these wonderful panelists' brains. I want to ask you, as we kind of leave this conversation, could each of you give me, I guess, one idea on what you think could be a new mechanism we could create coming out of this Digital Trust Forum, maybe looking at SG Tech, you know, for them to come up with a new work stream next year for us to work better together in PPP. So I'm going to start with Yang first. I wonder if you have any immediate thoughts.
Well, maybe I focus more on the area of capacity building, of how can we build up a greater talent pool to support businesses in the area of digital trust. I think one thing that the public sector can work with support from the private sector can work with support from the public sector will be in terms of the developing the capability and manpower. I think this is one area that, in our experience, the Singapore government is never stingy about with money. But it's not something that money alone can solve, because we do need the training capacity, we need the expertise. And that's where I think perhaps trade associations like the SG Tech working in the industry can bring in big players like AWS to conduct the training that the big companies can. You can train a lot more than what you need. If you need 50, you can train 100, and the other 50 can go to your competitors and to SMEs that need the talent. And if more companies can do that, and actually some are already doing it, then I think we can build up a bigger pool of tech talent, of digital trust talent in Singapore that will benefit the ecosystem as a whole.
Thank you so much for that. And you know, I think that is a great point. And at AWS, we have been trying to scale that. So we do a lot of, you know, kind of digital and remote training, and that's something that's already available, but really targeting like maybe specific groups of companies or people. I think that might be the next stage. So I think that's a great idea and something that, you know, we would love to work with SG Tech on the new year, maybe SBF as well, because I'm sure you have some very important data points on the kinds of companies who would best be able to use that support. I'm going to turn over to Zheng next. Zheng, what's your one suggestion for us?
The hypothesis of our company is that we're shifting, the world is shifting, right, from print data to digital data, and going forward is about verifiable data. So we believe that companies or public sectors alike, now is the right time to do the transition, to turn what used to be static data points and documents into live, verifiable data, so that you can then pass on that responsibility to always control that interaction downwards to the industry, or at the end of the day, put that control of the data and documents into the hands of the individual or the company that actually owns the data. And from there on, that's when we can solve a lot of problems like data consent, data residency, or transfer of data between countries, so on and so forth. So the whole idea, transform, change, and then start to put that decentralization of data control back into the hands of the individual. So that's what we think will work.
That's great. I mean, that's an amazing vision, right? And I think trust and accountability is one of those things that we always talk about in the abstract, But I think to be able to put some technology behind that and think about how do we then like push that down to even the individual end user, I think that would be amazing. So that's a vision. I don't know, SG Tech, if you're in the room somewhere, but it would be wonderful to see if we can figure out how do we actually enable that at scale. Because I think the challenge is, that's going to be the next challenge, is like, how do you ensure that that's a scalable technology that everybody can use and has access to and understand as well? Because I think education is probably that last bit. Finally, last but not least, definitely Ih-Ming, I would love to hear maybe one thought from you about what would be this special mechanism we could have for.
Sure. I made a mention earlier about capacity building in the governance and compliance space. I think that's certainly, and whether you want to call it a convening communities practice, etc., I think that could be one. I'm also going to cheat and maybe build on like Yong's point about this idea of talent that can circulate. If I kind of flip it a little and think a little bit about what the employee value proposition might be in this space, right? Because, and you know, it's quite observable. We observe this to a lot of government employees who have that policy acumen. They move into industry because they want that, they want to build their own kind of functional depth. They want that practitionership. But does it really have to be so binary, right? Could there be opportunities for either companies to be receptacles for people kind of, not so much revolving door, but, you know, circulate, if you will, and not just with large companies, but with smaller companies too, right? So that would be a raw idea. Not sure how we would operationalize that, but that could be something to think about. So I'll just leave it at that.
I mean, I almost think that if you look at a lot of other industries, especially some of the more traditional industries, like in the legal services or, for example, in accounting services, you often have like a, you know, kind of like list of people who are certified and authorized to practice, right? And I think to some extent, maybe part of building a digital trust framework is that, right? It's talking about trusted professionals. So maybe that's a way that we could do that.
Yeah, exactly. Professionalizing this space, right? What does proficiency look like? What does being a digital trust professional mean? Right, you need to develop both, you know, some industry and domain depth, maybe, and not just have handled like kind of local, more narrow issues, but regional, cross-border related issues, but also maybe some policy experience.
Yeah. And I mean, we've talked about that, I think, in the data protection space, in the cybersecurity space, even in the AI space, but I almost see this is all coming together in one. It goes beyond that. I think you mentioned use cases several times, and I think it is that. It's almost down to maybe use case specificity. So something to think about. I think we've given SG Tech 3 ideas. I'm going to show in a fourth one just for fun. I think Ih-Ming mentioned something about interoperability, and I know Young, you also mentioned something about convergence. And I think we always hear these terms being thrown around, and that's incredibly important for startups and SMEs in particular, but even for larger companies who are operating globally, it's a huge headache when we try and figure out how all these laws and regulations work together. So I think from AWS's perspective, something that we've been thinking about, and we'd love to see how we can partner with everyone on this panel, everyone in the room as well, it's really to think about how do we actually have global certifications for trusted digital infrastructure. Because at the end of the day, as you say, G2G, you know, that's going to take a while, there's complexity around that, but business still has to run. Underlying that. And I think when we are increasingly in a world where we are more and more digital and we're facing more and more new threats, part of it could be how do we make sure that the digital infrastructure and services layer is secure and that it is certified globally so we don't have to fight over all the small things and people can actually do business and focus on building great applications and services and thinking about trust from a more holistic perspective. So that's my final thought. With that, I think we've more or less come to the end of our panel. So thank you so much to all my fellow panelists here today. And thank you again once everybody in this room for joining us for, I guess, the inaugural Digital Trust Forum. We look forward to hopefully being able to do this again next year. But in the meantime, if you have any thoughts about digital trust, please feel free to reach out to me or anybody else on this panel. I think we'd love to hear your perspectives as well. So thank you so much. Thank you all for your time as well today.